Okay, thank you everyone for coming and being on time. And I'm Kath Chamberlain. I'm a Palawa Trawway woman from the northeast coast of Tasmania, and I'm Director of ANEMDA Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health and Wellbeing at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne. I'd like to start today by acknowledging that we're here on the traditional lands of the Bunurong and Woonwurrung speaking people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my sincere respects to elders, past and present. I warmly welcome you here to this really important session today on climate change and the health of Indigenous peoples. I'd like to, when we were first sort of starting to talk about these couple of sessions that we had to talk about the issues that are important for Indigenous peoples, we met with Janine Mohammed, the CEO of the Lowitja Institute, who's just recently moved on from that role, and she chose climate change as one of the most critical issues affecting Indigenous peoples around the world, as well as AI, and there'll be a session tomorrow about artificial intelligence and what that means for us as Indigenous communities as well. So as I'm sure you all know, climate change is an absolutely massive existential threat to the survival of not just humans, us as humans, but to all living things on this beautiful planet that we're so privileged to be on. And I know that people here in this room are not going to need to, it's something that we don't need to tell you, but I'm really looking forward myself to learning from an amazing lineup of speakers that we've got, an international lineup. So what we're going to do this afternoon is each speaker is going to speak for about 8 minutes, and then we're going to have a panel discussion where you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions and talk to the panel and really talk about these critical issues, one of these most critical issues of our time. So I'll just introduce our panel of the amazing speak-ups. So the first is Dr. Francis Nona, is a proud man from the Torres Strait who's a lecturer and early career researcher at the Queensland University of Technology Corumba Institute. His work is informed by a strong cultural upbringing, balanced with a career as a registered nurse and director of an Indigenous community-controlled health service in the Darling Downs. Mr. Nona has worked in clinical settings as a registered nurse, including juvenile detention centres, aged care, rehabilitation units, brain injury rehabilitation and Aboriginal medical services. He brings to academia a strong understanding of cultural engagement and protocol from his country, an understanding of the health system as it applies to First Nations and other Australians. He is a lead contributor to research focused on climate change and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and wellbeing, and he has a great commitment to improving the health of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nona to the stage. Thank you. Thank you. Second up, we've got Dr. Donald Wilson, who's Acting Dean of the College of Medicine, Nursing and Health Sciences at the Fiji National University. He's previously held the roles of Associate Dean, Research and Director of the Fiji Institute of Pacific Health Research and Head of the School of Public Health and Primary Care. Dr. Wilson is a public health physician and spent 12 years in Japan, where he obtained a PhD degree in the area of occupational and environmental epidemiology. His doctoral research was on respiratory health effects of ambient air pollution in industrial cities of northeastern China. His current areas of research interest are water-sensitive diseases and re-emerging communicable diseases, non-communicable diseases, and the importance of policy responses. Thank you, Dr. Wilson. And third up, we're going to have speaking to you is Dr. Rhys Jones. He's a public health physician and Associate Professor in Maori Health at the University of Auckland in Aotearoa, New Zealand. He has a leadership role in Maori health teaching and learning in the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences. His research addresses Indigenous health and health equity with an emphasis on environmental wellbeing and decolonial approaches to planetary health. He is a passionate advocate for health equity, Indigenous rights and climate justice. Reece was founding convener of the Aotearoa, the New Zealand Climate and Health Council, and is co-director of Climate Health Aotearoa, a national climate change and health research network. Thanks, Dr. Jones. And finally, but not least, we've got Jessica Walkers, who is, the project coordinator of Siderum Action Research Program, CARP, located within the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, Monash Art, Design and Architecture faculty. Her expertise is in environmental and climate security, understanding how the Earth's planetary physical properties and a changing climate impact communities in Australia and internationally. Jessica's specific interests are at the grassroots level for rural and remote communities and are centred on just transitions, ensuring all stakeholders receive appropriate outcomes during net zero transitions, specifically people in industry, Indigenous groups and cultures. She has a broad expertise working both locally and internationally within her field, with a commitment to understanding and engaging with everyday people, industry and businesses who are experiencing the impacts of climate change. Thanks, Jessica. Okay, so I'm really looking forward to this session this afternoon. And first up, I think we're going to have Dr. Nona, who's going to talk to us. So thank you.
First disclaimer, I'm a PhD candidate working towards a doctorate. Hope it doesn't change my positionality too much as we speak. Mina ke meso ngita murino moino, ngai ngimpa yamule keda ngau Nell Francis Nona, ina ngai ngipapa yakaman ngau zapul keda. Ngai Deibao clan, Torres Strait, Zerethkes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Francis Nona. I'm here this afternoon and I represent my clan, which is Deibao clan in the Torres Straits of Saibai Island. I come here on a day after sorry business, as you would have seen in the media, of one of my community members. So it was hard to head south as opposed to be heading north, but the work in advocacy doesn't end. Next slide. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land we are meeting today. I pay respects to their elders, past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities that may be here today. We walk in the footsteps of giants, and the knowledges that are passed down to inherently carry that responsibility moving forward. My presentation today, a brief overview, is understanding Indigenous health, real quickly, trying to fit it in 8 minutes. Impacts of climate change on Indigenous health and the existing evidence gaps and the importance of Indigenous knowledges. My PhD looks at health and climate within Torres Straits and how can we embed Indigenous knowledges into policy. So the policy priorities and strengthening research and data collection and community-based approaches and collaborative partnerships. So understanding Indigenous health goes beyond physical well-being. It encompasses a holistic approach, recognising the interconnectedness of culture, social structures and the environment. It is about acknowledging the health of not just the absence of illness and the presence of balance and harmony within oneself, the community and the environment. The worldview of Indigenous versus Western summarised is that people are as either dominant versus interconnected. Non-Indigenous people are humans at the top of the pyramid, and there is a hierarchy of importance. Often animals, from domestic to wild animals. In contrast, the Indigenous view is that there are interconnections between all. Indigenous people view 3 intersecting spheres of the physical, human, and sacred and spiritual worlds as being important to the ways of knowing, being, and doing. The task of understanding of the complex connection and this respect for the feminine is the factor to why non-Indigenous people have exploited the natural world and the natural pursuit for economic gains. Climate change poses significant threats to Indigenous communities' health. From disruptions in traditional food sources to the increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. Indigenous people are disproportionately affected. Moreover, these impacts exacerbate existing health disparities, further marginalising already vulnerable communities. Despite the issue's urgency, there are critical gaps in research and evidence related to Indigenous health and climate change. Our understanding is incomplete, hindering our ability to develop effective policies and interventions. These underscreens the need for more comprehensive data and studies addressing the intersectionality of Indigenous health and environmental factors. I lead a project from Lowitja looking at a rights-based approach and looking at international frameworks. And one of the things I said at Parliament last year is we start using these international frameworks to give voices for Indigenous people, work with us or fight us in the courts. And if you start to see the trend, Indigenous communities are forced to fight these fights over the courts. Traditional ecological knowledge passed down through generations offers invaluable insights into how Indigenous communities have adapted to environmental changes over millennia. Incorporating Indigenous perspectives into evidence-based policies is a matter of cultural respect and strategic imperative for addressing climate change impacts on health. Indigenous people have been lobbying to be meaningfully included in climate change policies since the 1997 Kyoto Protocol was adopted. Our priorities must reflect the situation's urgencies. We must prioritise Indigenous leadership and participation in policy development and decision-making processes. Strengthening research and data collection efforts is essential for fulfilling existing knowledge gaps. Community-based approaches empowering Indigenous communities to develop and implement sustainable health strategies tailored to the needs of that community. Lastly, fostering collaborative partnership is vital for driving meaningful change. Investing in research initiatives focused on Indigenous health and environmental change is essential for fulfilling existing knowledge gaps and informing evidence-based policies. Building capacity within Indigenous communities for data collection, analysis and interpretation are critical to ensuring their voices are heard and the needs are addressed. Community-based approaches empower Indigenous communities to take ownership of their health and well-being by encouraging with communities directly, engaging as we will develop culturally appropriate, sustainable and effective interventions. These approaches also foster a sense of ownership and agency among community members, leading to more meaningful and lasting change. Collaborative partnerships between Indigenous communities, researchers, policymakers and other stakeholders are essential for driving meaningful change. By working together, we can develop and implement policies and interventions that prioritise Indigenous health and environmental justice. So in closing, on my last slide, I'll leave you with one question. This is a community from where I'm from on Saibai Island and my elders, so I show these photos, but my question still stands. In conclusion, let us commit to action. Let us recognise the issue's urgencies and work together to address the intersecting challenges of Indigenous health and climate change. Our collective efforts today will shape the well-being of a generation to come. We leave here today asking the question, who are we missing from the tables where the decisions are made? I say to you all here, we need voices from community for policy to be changed. Ki meso in my language, big thank you.
Working.
Bulavanaka, ladies and gentlemen. I am Donald Wilson from the Fiji National University and also the director of the Fiji Institute of Pacific Health Research. In recognition of both people and place, I respectfully acknowledge the past, present, and future traditional custodians of the land on which we stand, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung, and Bunurong peoples. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to give a brief presentation on nested systems thinking and how this relates to our primary research program, WHISH, Watershed Interventions for Systems Health, and how this can dovetail with the work that we are all here to plan. Climate predictions for the Pacific Islands suggests that the region will continue to experience increased intensity and frequency of extreme weather events due to climate change. Rising sea temperatures and changing atmospheric conditions are expected to contribute to more severe tropical cyclones and heavier rainfall. This trend aligns with global observations that intense tropical cyclones are becoming more common with each degree of global warming. This paper that was published by two colleagues of ours from the WHISH project, these projections translate to greater flood risk impacts. The flooding following cyclones and prolonged rainfall has been linked to outbreaks of a variety of waterborne bacterial diseases such as typhoid, Shigella, and leptospirosis. In this example from 2012, Fiji was impacted by sequential tropical depressions that caused widespread flooding. These events resulted in substantial population displacement and significant post-disaster increases in leptospirosis cases 3 to 8 weeks following each of the major flooding episodes. Dr. Sarah Nelson, our first PhD graduate from the WHISH research program, which I'll introduce shortly, published this notable paper that explores how weather patterns like rain and seasonality can predict disease outbreaks from syndromes associated with leptospirosis, typhoid, and dengue in Fiji. By analyzing syndromic surveillance data from 2016 to 2020 against weather patterns, she found that by tracking when and how much it rains, we can forecast the likely times for disease outbreaks, which helps in planning timely healthcare responses. But climate-sensitive infectious diseases are only one of the most obvious parts of the story. In the public health space and in the public discourse surrounding climate change and the well-being of indigenous peoples, notions of loss of place and place attachment aren't really considered as a driver Pacific Islanders' well-being. I'd like to share a quote from a recent paper that's highlighted here that I think encapsulates what place attachment means from a Pacific Islanders' perspective. Indigenous peoples do not just belong to a place. Rather, they often see themselves as embodying place itself. The terms whenua from Aotearoa, enua from Vanuatu, fonua from Tonga, and Vanua from Fiji, for example, refer both to the land and to an ancestral connection to the land. Words for land and dirt are often synonymous with words for placenta, whenua, enua, fonua, and Vanua, and as such suggest life and land are intrinsically connected. For myriad Pacific cultures, the common practice of returning the placenta to the earth further embeds this notion of being of the land. Such a connection means that any radical transformation of the land or separation from it, be it through voluntary or involuntary displacement, is likely to be a catalyst for profound identity loss. And these same connections apply to the sea as well as the land. I now want to highlight the transformative and highly innovative Watershed Interventions for Systems Health program that I've been involved with, which uses place as a focal point for health and well-being. Our WHISH program recognizes that managing watersheds holistically is the key to simultaneously achieving various environmental, economic, and health goals that support sustainable development. This approach allows for targeted actions to improve overall Just skip that. Yeah. To improve overall systems health, tailored to each unique local environment, and includes the active participation of communities who have the deep cultural connection to these regions, thus promoting sustainable practices and well-being. Sorry. These opportunities have particular relevance in Pacific Island watersheds, where terms in local language such as Vanua in Fiji, Enua, Vanuatu, and the others that I had mentioned before, including Ahupua'a in Hawaii, refer both to customary tenure units connecting watersheds to the sea, as well as to the indigenous ancestral, this computer doesn't like me, as well as to the indigenous ancestral connections to those places. In these contexts, place attachment driven by a strong desire to maintain cultural identity and practice incentivizes indigenous people to take actions that support the key dimensions of health and well-being, which include maintaining and restoring ecosystems that provide critical services and also natural resources that underpin cultural vitality and community health. Central to our strong community engagement and our lasting relationship with communities has been our extensive community-level free prior informed consent, FPIC, and Wish Fiji's approach to this FPIC process ensures community autonomy through meetings led and scheduled by local leaders inclusive of all demographics. Prior consent entails respecting cultural protocols and ensuring comprehensive project understanding without commencing any project-related activities without community approval. Being informed means providing detailed, translated project information discussing potential impacts and protections, and establishing a grievance mechanism, leading to a consensus decision that is recognized by relevant local authorities. And over a 5-month period, we conducted a 3-phased FPIC process in all 29 communities, which focused on initial visits to local and provincial government partners to describe project objectives, comprehensive community awareness sessions with participation of broad segments of each community, including men and women, elders and youth, and following adequate time for internal community discussion, a final visit to each community with representatives from the Ministry of Itoke Affairs to obtain granted signed consent. When all phases of FPIC were completed for all communities, only then did we undertake household-level consent for the 311 households that were enrolled in the project. So just for the purpose, for those of you who might not know about or who've never heard of FPIC, it's a specific right granted to indigenous peoples recognized in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UN DRIP, which aligns with the universal right to self-determination. FPIC allows indigenous peoples to provide or withhold or withdraw consent at any point regarding projects impacting their territories. FPIC allows indigenous peoples to engage in negotiations to shape the design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of projects. So you should be able to find this document, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Within that, you can read about what free prior consent is, and the consent is free, is given voluntarily and without coercion and intimidation or manipulation. These are all important, and within that document in Article 32, it says indigenous people, in number 2, for example, states shall consult and cooperate in good faith with indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories and other resources, particularly in connection with the development, utilization, or exploitation of mineral, water, or other resources. It's an interesting document that I think we should all try to read. So we've then been walking through, as part of the project, through a step-by-step participatory process within each community to develop a water and sanitation safety plan where different priorities for management are identified. As noted, some of these interventions are nature-based. while others may involve putting in new infrastructure, like this water reservoir that provides a flow of clean water to households in that village. The outcomes of sustained impact, those three on the slide: strengthen systems governance. 20 out of the 29 communities with increased female representation on water committees. 24 out of the 29 communities with village health workers on water committees. Ownership over actions. All 29 communities were implementing watershed management actions themselves. 26 out of 154 completed interventions were fully implemented by government and partner organizations. And the priorities were integrated into provincial development plans, and these watershed interventions that were recommended as part of the project were written into the individual village development plans. So to round off very quickly, a quick plug for our vision for what we are calling Tandra Vanua initiative, which is building upon existing relevant investments by global philanthropic bodies and development aid agencies in the region. For example, the WISH project, the RISE project, and the establishment of the Fiji Institute of Pacific Health Research to lead regionally appropriate approaches to sustainable health. Tandra Vanua is an action research hub that weaves the research centers of FIPA together while networking into the most influential academic and policy architecture of the region. It will be led by the Pacific for the benefit of the region and the planet. So what is Tandra Vanua? What does it mean? Tandra is the Fijian word for dream, to dream of or a visionary scheme. Vanua is a very important word in the Indo-Pacific context that derives from a Proto-Austronesian word Banua, meaning land, home, or village. So just to plug and to end for today, we are also, as an extension of this project, planning the Oceania Planetary Health Forum. This is likely to happen in November of this year. It's likely to happen in Fiji, in Nadi. All are welcome, and and those are the partners who are supporting us in funding this Health Planetary Forum. Winaka wakaleo, and thank you so much for your attention.
Kia ora tātou. A tēnei te mihi nunui kia koutou. Ko Rhys Jones tōku ingoa, heri tēnei no Ngāti Kahungunu. Me mihi ka tika ki ngā tangata o Wurundjeri, o te Iwi Kulin, ngā mana whenua o tēnei rohe o Naam. Ka nui te mihi hoki ki oku hoa I te pai nā. Huri no te whare tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everyone, thank you and welcome. Good to be here today. My name's Rhys. As I mentioned in my intro there, I'm from, or I hail from Ngāti Kahungunu, so our people are from this little place called Wairoa on the east coast of the North Island of New Zealand. And I just wanted to acknowledge, I also in my little mihi there acknowledged the people of this land and this unceded land, and pay our respects to ancestors past, present and future. And to Indigenous peoples everywhere. So I'm going to be talking about this very easy topic of Indigenous health and climate justice, probably taking a little bit of a bigger picture view. And really, I guess one of the key points I want to make is, I'll click through with this, is that we can't really understand climate change and Indigenous well-being, or even climate change itself and other planetary health crises, unless we understand its context in terms of colonialism. And often, when people think about climate change, they think of a root cause as being fossil fuels and how we burn too many fossil fuels, and linking it back to the Industrial Revolution, etc. But it actually goes back much further than that, and much deeper in terms of the root causes. And so, as this quote says, the ecocidal logics that now govern our world are not inevitable or human nature, but are the result of a series of decisions that have their origins and reverberations in colonisation. Okay, and so I think that's a really key part of what I'm trying to get across, and I'll talk through a little bit more as we go through. But really, I think it reflects a departure from the original instructions that we came with, or that our ancestors passed down to us over many, many thousands of generations. And you know, if you like to think about it, this is one way that North American, Native American people often think about those ways of being that are essential to live in balance with nature and with everything else, all our other relations, human and non-human. These ideas of having original instructions that guide us in ways that can achieve those ways of living. And so, yeah, if you like, the Earth does have this instruction manual, and somehow along the way, certain societies, and unfortunately the ones that are now kind of globally dominant, decided to just abandon those original instructions and decide to live by completely different instructions that turn out to be pretty horrific in terms of ecological crises and other things that result from that. So, yeah, the sense is that, you know, once the Earth is viewed as a commodity to be exploited, rather than an ancestor to be held in good relation, so the ways in which Indigenous peoples might think, and what Francis and Donald have already been talking about with this idea that we're not, you know, we're not just people on the land, we're people of the land and of the water and of this whole planet. And we link back through kinship relationships to the earth, the sky, the waters, the other animals and plants and everything that we live with. Once you kind of abandon those relationships and the responsibilities that come with those, it then becomes possible to do these horrible exploitative things that end up with the planetary crises that we're now experiencing. So I think one way to think about colonisation is, well, it causes a whole lot of destruction, right? Destruction of people, populations, genocide, destruction of nature, ecocide, destruction of languages and cultures, ethnocide, and destruction of knowledges, epistemicide. So one of the key points I wanted to make is it's not just the environmental damage that we see through colonialism, through colonisation, but it actually undermines and destroys the very worldviews, values and knowledges that we need to tackle the climate crisis and to address the other planetary health crises that we're facing. And just a small point on this, or perhaps not a small point, but we see these things playing out over, you know, long periods in many, many different places around the world as a process of colonisation. I think we're seeing them in a really extreme and acute form in Palestine right now. And so just to say that one of the key things that I think we all need to be doing in relation to climate justice is standing up, speaking out about the atrocities, about the genocide that is happening in Gaza right now. Ka pai. Thank you. And so what I think we have is a classic example of trying to solve a problem within the same consciousness that created it. So we understand colonialism, capitalism as key drivers of the climate crisis, and yet a lot of the solutions, in fact, you know, many of our dominant solutions that we're using at a global level, at a national level, are rooted in systems of colonialism and capitalism. So it shouldn't really surprise us that we're pretty much failing to tackle the climate crisis as it is at the moment. And that's where indigenous knowledges come in, and I think other speakers have talked about this already, but really critically, if we want to tackle the climate crisis, we do need to return to those original instructions, indigenous knowledges that have enabled us to live in ways that live in balance with everything else on this planet for generations. And when I talk about privileging indigenous knowledges, sometimes we get the sense from non-indigenous peoples that the expectation is that, oh, well, indigenous peoples will offer up their knowledges so that we can co-opt them, reinterpret them, and use them in ways that, you know, suit our colonial capitalist ways of doing things. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about indigenous self-determination. and that actually for Indigenous knowledges to be used in a way that's effective, we actually need Indigenous peoples having the sovereignty, the autonomy to use those knowledges and apply them. So what does that mean in practical terms? I think just some ideas here about what we need to do, and this is all of us, to address the crises that we're facing and to take some actions that will achieve planetary health. So I think it is about restoring our connections with nature and with Indigenous communities, explicit recognition of the rights of nature. We're starting to see that with some examples of features of the environment being accorded legal personhood, for example. Not necessarily the way I would like to see things done, but at least it's acknowledging rights that go beyond just human rights. Dismantling systems that perpetrate patriarchal violence, critiquing the dominant paradigms, the colonial knowledge systems, as not the be-all and end-all, so that we create space for Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledges. Land back is a really important one. We can't utilise Indigenous knowledges if we don't have the land and the resources to actually and have the self-determination over those lands to be able to affect those changes. Protection and revitalisation of Indigenous languages. A critical part of knowledge is the language that goes with that, and so anything that we can do to support Indigenous languages, cultures, is actually climate action. And support for communal intergenerational ways of living. So really all we're asking us to do is to remember, to imagine and craft the worlds that we cannot live without, just as we dismantle the ones that we cannot live within. And so it is a challenge, right? There's this tension that actually what we're talking about here is decolonisation. It's about dismantling the systems that are causing the problems and the crises that are right in front of us. But at the same time, we feel compelled to try to work within the current systems so that at least we can minimise the harm that they're creating. And yet by doing so, we kind of uphold and legitimate those systems. And so this is a tricky tension, but I think something that we all need to work on, this breaking down the things that are causing the problems while rebuilding new ways of doing things. So just in summary, I guess key point is that we can't understand planetary health crises unless we trace them back to the root causes of colonialism. That means actually different worldviews, completely different paradigms in terms of thinking about how we solve them, rather than reverting back to the same levels of consciousness, the same sort of paradigms that we're currently trying. And genuine transformation doesn't mean just grafting on some Indigenous knowledges onto our current approaches. It means actually dismantling systems, decolonising and re-indigenising, and returning to those original instructions. And I guess probably the key point here amongst everything is that means committing to upholding Indigenous rights, and associated with that comes the rights of everything else that ultimately, we need to restore those relationships, restore the justice at a multi-species level if we're going to really address the crises that we're facing. Kia ora tātou.
Hello everyone, my name is Jessica Walters, and as was mentioned earlier, I'm the project coordinator of the Chitterum Action Research Program at Monash University. Today I'm here to speak from the perspective as a Palawa woman. So and my people are from the northwest coast of Tasmania. I'm originally from Smithton, which is a very rural town in Tassie. So I'm here speaking from that perspective today and the work that I've done along the way. So I wanted to begin by kind of telling you what we really already know, which is that 370 million Indigenous people are impacted globally by the threat of climate change. So that's an astronomical number. In 2018, disease burden for Australian First Nations people was more than double that of non-Indigenous Australians. And as a whole, they lost almost 240,000 years of healthy life due to ill health and premature death. And why I point this out is because one of the leading 5 disease groups contributing to this burden was actually mental health. And for Indigenous people, climate change and the impacts of climate change have a significant impact on Indigenous mental health and well-being. So I wanted to focus on where climate change does impact, and that's 4 areas which I've listed there. So obviously through rising sea levels, coastal erosion, all that kind of thing, weather events, drought, flooding, it really harms our cultural sites, and that's a real concern for us. It also harms food and shelter supply, again through coastal erosion, flooding, drought. So that's harming food security and housing security. Indigenous people are also being forced to leave their country, and I find this really interesting, the concept of climate migration and the forced displacement of Indigenous people, which again harms their identity, it harms their culture, and therefore harms their wellbeing and health. And the IPCC actually estimates that by 2050, 20 million people, including Indigenous, will be displaced due to climate change. Again, this loss of culture and identity, and also being cut off from services, is another practical example of extreme weather events, especially up in here in Australia, up in the Northern Territory, when there's large flooding events. A lot of remote and rural Indigenous communities actually get cut off from services. Again, isolating them and impacting their mental health, but also isolating them from health services. So actually being able to get the health services that they need. And lastly, I also wanted to point out the vector-borne and waterborne diseases and heat stress, and that Indigenous people actually have a higher chance of anxiety and depression than non-Indigenous. So I wanted to paint that little bit of a picture, but I really want to focus on the positives and the solutions that Indigenous knowledge can actually bring to combating climate change and therefore improving Indigenous health. So obviously climate change is a global issue, and sustainability actually can be one of the solutions in combating climate change. Now, I really wanted to showcase that for Indigenous people, everything that we do on a daily basis is really underpinned by this concept of sustainability, connection to country, understanding of land and its interactions with people, and passing down traditions of how to actually care for this land. And really sustainability, although it is a modern term, for thousands of years, Indigenous people have been practicing sustainability, ensuring that both people and planet for future generations is cared for. And I really wanted to also highlight the importance of storytelling, which is a primary way of history, for tracking history for thousands of years for Indigenous people. And I think storytelling and the stories that have been passed down, especially through my own mob and First Nations Australians, is showcasing how innovative and the solutions that Indigenous people can actually bring to combating issues such as climate change. So I actually wanted to give an example, and this is a pretty famous example in terms of where storytelling has actually showcased this. And it actually talks to dramatic sea level rise. So the map up here on the screen indicates 21 sites that Indigenous people had pointed out that were above water originally, approximately 7,000 years ago, when obviously water was held in ice sheets and glaciers. And these sites, for Indigenous people, they were on them, they were using them. And then the stories tell us that there was a huge great flood, that's what they called it, and that is where the sea level rose, and that's what has been passed down actually through 300 generations. That story has been told, and it has been shown that yes, the stories are correct, and yes, they are factual, and I think that's remarkable how through 300 generations those stories of sea level rise have been spoken of. And actually a example in our own backyard here in Melbourne is actually Port Phillip Bay. So the story tells us that 10,000 years ago, when Port Phillip Bay was high and dry, it was actually a lovely ground for hunting emu and kangaroo. And so Aboriginal people used that land for that. When the sea levels rose and the Great Flood came, the stories actually tell us that the land was taken away and they no longer could hunt. And so that just showcases how they spoke of Port Phillip Bay back then. So what are the solutions that Indigenous people can actually offer? What are some practical things that Indigenous people have told and can tell us in terms of combating climate change? And I really wanted to focus on land and resource management. So first I wanted to speak to agriculture. Personally, my work is very much heavily involved in industry. Personally, my family are involved in 3 different industries, so I have quite a connection to land through that way too. So I always find it interesting where my Indigenous roots can also be bedded into modern day. So unfortunately, less than 1% of people in the agricultural sector in Australia actually identify as Indigenous. However, the knowledge that Indigenous people can bring to this sector is second to none. They have a deep understanding of different crops, seeds, how the soil works, different climates, what are the best geological and geographical locations for different things. And I also want to touch on, from a health perspective, the plants that Indigenous people have used here in Australia and continue to in terms of medical purposes. So I've highlighted 3 here. So eucalyptus, obviously modern day we use eucalyptus oil, but for Indigenous people it's used for pains and fevers and chills. Emu bush leaves was actually used to wash sores and cuts, and goat's foot plant was actually to alleviate the sting of treading on something that stung them, such as a stingray or stonefish in the waters. So I thought that was really interesting. Secondly, I wanted to touch on aquaculture, giving a more practical example, and I really wanted to focus on resource management because as Indigenous people, we really live by only taking what we need, and I think that's a really important point when we talk about sustainability and understanding how to replenish what you take as well. So obviously the aquaculture industry is essential to the Indo-Pacific region. It is something that's being extremely harmed through climate change, whether this be sea, ocean temperature rise, ecosystem harm. This also induces overfishing and the loss of fish stocks. And a really interesting fact is that globally, Indigenous people located in coastal areas actually consume 15 times more seafood than non-Indigenous in those locations. However, they have a significantly lesser impact on the coastal zones that they're fishing in. And I think that really is a testament to their traditional ways of fishing and how they understand the ecosystem. So I really wanted to highlight here the use of fish traps, and this is an example here in Australia. And how these worked was the different areas were created with stones, and each family along the river actually had a responsibility to look after the ecosystem, the hydrology, the ecology of these different ponds. And it's actually, this one here is probably the oldest man-made structure on Earth because it actually dates 40,000 years. And it's heritage listed in New South Wales, but it is an elaborate network of rock weirs and holding ponds and actually stretches for nearly half a kilometre. It's the largest group of Aboriginal fish traps here in Australia. And lastly, I actually wanted to touch on forestry and the use of fire. So for Indigenous people, the use of fire is very important, it's very helpful, but it's also the ability of Indigenous people to understand how to manage the land and what's best for it. Obviously, they have an understanding of the land, its plants, its animals, and how fire can assist with regeneration and managing potential hazards such as bushfires and creating the desired vegetation. So for Indigenous people, some communities call it fire stick burning. In modern day, we probably call it back burning or environmental burning, but it involves burning small areas of low-lying vegetation to alleviate potential bushfire risk. It's also great for creating fertile soils, creating habitat for natural plants and animals, and also eradicating exotic weeds. It's also evidence has shown that fire management conducted early in the fire season in Northern Australia specifically actually can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by reducing the likelihood of more severe bushfires later on in the season. So there are just some short examples. I just wanted to provide those practical examples for you, but that's all I had today. Thanks for having me.
So, can you all hear me? Yep. So thanks for those really fascinating presentations, and I think it's given us a chance to really get to know these amazing experts that we've got here to talk to now for the next 45 minutes. So I think if you'd like to start to think about some questions that you might have, and we've got some roving mics coming there. This is a really great opportunity to, really learn from eminent Indigenous speakers here, and I think you really talked about that beautifully, Reece, showing that it is a different way of thinking that is going to find the solutions to the climate challenges that we are facing today. So thank you for sharing all that. I might just start off with one question, which I'd really like you all to reflect on a little bit in this meeting, because here we are, a meeting of 1,200 leaders from around the world, and I'd like you to think about what you think the international community can do to support Indigenous peoples in responding to the threat of climate change. And I don't know, would you like to start with that?
I'll happily start. When we think about the international community, here in Australia, we sit in the global north, even though it was stated again this morning that we're in the south. So the Indigenous communities don't get those trust funds that sit on an international stage to advocate and fight, because we sit in a developed, country that on an international stage says that we don't need it. And if we look around in some of these communities, that is not the case, where there are communities that are looking for ways for advocacy on, the changing climate. And it's an unfortunate thing that it's the resources and the land within Australia that we exploit that puts us in a position to sit in the global north, let alone the people of that land aren't getting those supports and advocacy. Yeah.
Thanks, Francis. Anyone else like to comment on that?
Thanks, Catherine. I think it would really differ depending on particularly the country's economic abilities, because I'm just thinking and comparing the Aboriginal peoples of Australia as compared to maybe I could talk about the Itoke people in my country. And access to climate funding, for instance, is very much dependent on the powers that be in mostly the developed and high-income countries. I think they are able to leverage those funds much easier and readily than those who are not. And so I like what Francis and Reece had said, and I think when engaging with Indigenous communities, it really boils down to respect and just understanding that it is the Indigenous people who have the traditional and first-hand knowledge of the land and the ecosystems that they live in. So the effects of climate change in each country might be different based on the geography and so many other factors related to those countries. But to respond to the effects of climate and climate change to these different settings is of course different, but everyone is accessing the same pot of money. And so I think countries and those that control these finances also need to understand that there is an important role of understanding the role of Indigenous people if we want to be able to tackle the effects of climate change ethically and respectfully, so that we ensure that we can go back to the way people lived before, and that is using those traditional knowledges.
Yeah, so I'd support those comments. And also I think, just referring back to what I was talking about, with this idea of, dismantling systems of colonialism and capitalism and, reinvesting in or revitalising Indigenous ways of being and supporting and upholding Indigenous rights. Might sound nice and roll off the tongue, but it becomes quite hard when you think about what does that actually mean for us in our day-to-day practice. And so if I was trying to talk to people from the international community, I think it's about, because people obviously work in a variety of different contexts, and, a wide range of different situations. I think it's about identifying, whatever our context is, those leverage points where we can maybe drive a wedge into the way things are currently operating and try to turn things around so that we develop, virtuous cycles rather than often what we see at the moment, which are vicious cycles. And really trying to, whatever it may be, even though it may seem like something relatively minor in whatever our professional roles are, that actually turn things around and disrupt the systems in the way that supports, upholding Indigenous well-being or disinvesting from capitalist colonial systems. And so I think that's kind of the idea that I'd try and get across, although, it's then a matter of how does someone translate that into their day-to-day practice. And that requires a lot of thinking, reflection, and doing the hard work to work out what that means for each of us. I guess the other point I'd make just briefly is that having worked with quite a few non-Indigenous peoples on this topic, I think this idea of the original instructions can apply to everyone, and that maybe even if we're not Indigenous, it's about going back however many generations to think through, well, what are my original ancestral instructions, and how can I revitalise those in the way I live and the way I practice? Kia ora.
And I think I'll just sum up really quickly there. I think we need to kind of also take a bit of a step back in terms of, speaking with the international community. It's also about providing resources and opportunities for Indigenous people to actually get to the table in the first place, to have these conversations. I think there needs to be more Indigenous involvement and actually providing the resources and the pathways for Indigenous members from around the world to sit around a table, because it's great to have a voice, but it's really hard to get to the table and actually speak what you're thinking as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. Is there any questions in the audience? We've got quite a few. Great.
Yeah, thank you. Jonathan Patz, University of Wisconsin, and also here at Monash on sabbatical. I have a question that is shows my impatience, because I think we have a crisis, the climate crisis, and we're 3 minutes before midnight, and yet we need to get all hands on deck. We need everyone to help out. And aside from, we certainly don't want to co-opt knowledge, but how do we bring all hands on deck and over the multiple generations of terrible relationships? It takes a long time to rebuild trust and relationship. How do we leverage in a positive way and get all hands on deck, all knowledge to help us out before 3 minutes before midnight?
Very big question. This is where I was trying to showcase in my work in the short time that I had, is like having the relationships with communities, but you working with Indigenous scholars. And, I think back to growing up on country on Sober Island and being initiated traditionally, and the understanding of our constellation and seeing where stars sit at different times of the year. These are important knowledges to reinterpret on our ways of being through when do we start creating water flows from our garden so that water doesn't sit and ruin our crops. But it's having that relationship, which you say is in the past it's been damaging going into communities, but working with Indigenous scholars, working with communities, not as a seagull in, flying out, and building sustainable relationships that goes beyond the project. And that is true empowerment. 3 minutes to midnight, well, let's use a minute and a half on a relationship that will go beyond midnight.
Thanks, Jonathan. We all know money is the necessary evil. So we'll talk about those who have money to ensure that this, whatever plans, even globally or locally, there are to addressing the issues related to climate change. If I take DFAT as, let's say DFAT as the body that's giving funds, I think the donor really needs to be able to create make the rules, and say, those who've demonstrated community engagement come to the front. Then out of those who've demonstrated community engagement, let's look at what does community engagement really mean. Because we know that a lot of people like to get the paper signed by this particular community and that's signed off. That's not what it means. So I think, so case in point, I know that I'm trying to make a point of my presentation, but this real engagement with communities, it takes time. It took us just 2 months to get the biomedical ethics process, but it took 5 months to engage with communities. What happens within that period is we get the respect. They fully understand what it is that we want to do. They know that it benefits them in the end. But when we do this tokenistically and, just like we're researchers, it passes off very badly as, for us as researchers. But I can guarantee that when people truly engage in this respectful manner, we have their vote for the rest of the time that we have to engage with them going forward. And I think that's the best way to invest your taxpayers' funds. And this is going to go on forever. So, the issue with climate is going to go on forever. But I think it's going to need money, and I think the funders need to ensure that money is used the right way with the right criteria.
Kia ora, Jonathan. Thanks for that question. I think one thing I didn't mention is that I'm in the process of just finishing up my doctorate, and I've been doing a lot of reading, and so I'm probably going to give you a fairly academic answer to your question. But one thing I would say is referring to the work of Kyle White, who's a Native American scholar, does a lot of work around climate change and Indigenous people's well-being. And he talks about relational tipping points and ecological tipping points. And so ecological tipping points being the sort of thing you're talking about, 3 minutes to midnight, and the fact that we just don't have time to muck around. But at the same time, we tend to prioritise those over the relational issues, and particularly thinking about relationships with Indigenous peoples. And, he would suggest that if we attack climate change with too much urgency, then we can't do that in a way that upholds the relational justice, and we will inevitably do harm and further erode the rights of Indigenous peoples. And I always think, is there a way that we can try and navigate so that we do both? And I haven't quite come up with an answer yet, but I think that one of the things I do think about is that at the very least we can stop doing some of the harms that are currently happening. I think about, like in our country, in New Zealand, we've recently had a new government come in, and like a few other places around the world, it's swung way over to the right. And, we're seeing just massive erosion of Indigenous people's rights and attacks on all sorts of structurally oppressed people and groups within our society. And one of the things that I think is that, if we want to try and move forward with the types of emissions reduction and, sustainable action on climate change, but at the same time not just run roughshod over Indigenous peoples and other marginalised groups, then we need to actually think about stopping doing the harms and the harmful ways of engaging that we're currently doing, and do the sorts of things that we've been talking about with bringing Indigenous peoples to the tables and actually returning lands and sovereignty to Indigenous peoples.
Any other questions?
Hi, I hope you can hear me. So I'm Ben Murray from University of Sydney. And just to maybe touch a little bit on Jonathan's description of the dilemma, but to ask your opinion around the best way to proceed. Given, I think, one defining feature of the modern world with all its elements is that policy is evidence-based. And that's a good thing, but it's also something that's sometimes holds back progress. And I was really, Donald, your reference to the Tundra Wanoa vision for Fiji and for Pacific Planetary Health. Just want to ask your opinion on how do we build an evidence base to truly show that these principles work, that they deliver the best outcomes for people and place. Because I don't think we don't have a program of indigenous-driven ethical research with a very clear outcomes that we, do you think there's scope for something like this and this may be the right time?
Thanks, Ben. I'm not going to pretend as, like I'm the expert on that, but just basing off of our experience through the work that's been happening in Fiji and the Pacific. So while our research institute is based in Fiji, over the 140 years that we've served, while based in Fiji, we've educated most of the health professionals across the Pacific. And over the years, because of this engagement with the rest of the Pacific, well, there's 16 to 22 countries that are our neighbors, the cultures are similar. Geopolitically, we might be similar. But I think there are these differences in the cultures and the traditional knowledges really demands that we know them. And if I could just go off on a tangent from your question, even though we have indigenous peoples in our countries, the generation that we're currently raising are also looking at Western values as more attractive than their traditional. And so it is imperative that parents continue to teach their children. It's difficult for a country like Fiji, where our population is now 60% indigenous, 30% Indo-Fijian, and 10% the others. There are some countries like Tonga and Samoa, which are largely homogeneous of Tongan people, Samoan people, where it's easier to teach these traditional knowledges. And so I see how difficult it might be for countries like Australia. But I think these are all important. But the projects, as like the WISH project, for instance, we have the RISE program as well, which looks at informal settlements. But it's important that we really start somewhere, and I think this particular project has helped us realize that from a typical scientific, a researcher's perspective, it's too long an engagement, it's too much risk. If it takes 5 months, if it takes 7 months for the ethics process, I mean, you can imagine what the donors, what the funders are going to say, that's way too long on your Gantt chart, you can't do that. But we've got to tell the people who don't understand it that this is what is required. You have got to understand that if you want to invest in this kind of work, follow, what is right. And so I think we need to go towards this ethical space where the communities themselves own the work that you want to help them to see. And so even if it's difficult, to go back to your question, Ben, even if it's difficult, I think we need to start somewhere. And the gathering of yourselves here today with that interest is the starting point, I think.
Yeah, and the term that was used is, what is evidence? And when I think I'm so busy fighting the fight of my epistemology, my methodology, my theoretical framework to get to a place to show the evidence, I'm fighting backwards. I haven't even got to the table to show you what the evidence is. And when we use that term, whose evidence, whose theoretical framework have we used?
Thank you, brother. It is, for me to hear this conversation, particularly yourself, Reece, to talk a little bit about where and what climate changes stem from with regards to colonisation. For me, that's super powerful. So thank you for all of you today. Now, just to brother over here too, it made me think about, from an Aboriginal man, to think about, well, things aren't funded because it'd have to debunk the narrative that's been written about Aboriginal people for the last 200 years, that we didn't really have nothing to give. So for me, understanding how do you shift this survivalist ethos that sits within a lot of the mainstream institutions and corporate structures that we're fighting as Aboriginal Australians. You put something up there earlier, brother, that said organisations or companies can act in good faith. Well, what does that mean? I've worked up in the territories and some of the remote areas, and you see these big mining companies come in and they put in a couple of little programs to support some employment in the community, but there's no mechanisms to support people who've not been employed before in a different system, and it's just that cycle of going back and forth. So I think that needs to change. But I think more to the point before, and this is probably a question now, how do we shift that power imbalance? You know, how do we get recognised at the table? One old auntie said to me one day, she said, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. And I think that we're always on that menu. We're always being talked about as First Nations people. And so, you know, for me, my mother left school in grade 6. You know, I've got 2 master's degrees. I'm doing a PhD at the moment, and I still can't get a seat at the table. So how do you see that happening for First Nations peoples? Or where have you seen it happen?
I might talk to that a little bit. A lot of the work I do as well is encompassed in this idea of just transitions, and I'm not sure if that's something people here know about, but pretty much what it means is that when we're going through a transition, whatever that might be, whether it's sustainability, you might go into a town and take away a coal mine and put in a renewable source. How do you make sure that all stakeholders involved get what they deem as just at the end of the outcome? And it is a very interesting space to work in, and it's something that's still developing. But I agree with you. I think especially when it comes to Indigenous people, we need to ensure that what they see as just is what's actually being put forward and on the table. And I think we really need to understand how Indigenous people want to be engaged, how they want to be involved, and it needs to be Indigenous-led too. I think we really need to start looking at how we can do that better, and I think more work needs to be done in terms of the just transition process, because again, it's a research method, but how can you quantify what is just for someone? So I think that's definitely somewhere that needs to be more investigated.
I would just add to that to say it's a real challenge, because I think colonialism, you know, as I sort of talked about, one of its key sort of features is around erasing Indigenous knowledges so that it can supplant those with their own Western knowledge systems, and that's kind of still the way that colonialism functions, and therefore, you know, it's always a battle to have the legitimacy of Indigenous knowledges recognised, whether that's at sort of government level, in academia, or, you know, even community levels. So I think, you know, those are constant battles that we keep having to have. I think part of the answer is Indigenous peoples claiming their own space or claiming our own spaces for those things to happen. You know, like we've seen with Indigenous research methodologies, developing their own kind of validity and legitimacy, not needing to be necessarily recognised by Western research or knowledge as valid. And, you know, just examples like that where we can sort of claim a space for this is valid in its own right as Indigenous knowledges. And I think the other thing that I would say is that because that doesn't necessarily get us even a seat at the policy table or the mainstream table, a lot of the onus is actually on our non-Indigenous colleagues to try and break down the barriers to getting recognition of Indigenous knowledges, and so that you know, we can't do that fight on our own, and so it's up to our non-Indigenous colleagues to create those spaces, to you know, even step aside and say, no, we need Indigenous peoples here at the table and with actually influence in this whole process. Yeah.
And I just wanted to support that by saying we've got to stop seeing it as an equilibrium space when we talk about the cultural interface. You know, NACADA's been writing about it since 2007, but many Indigenous scholars have stated that it's an unequilibrium, and we're selling it off that it's equal. And it, you know, within all that is the ontological limits that we are losing, you know, coming in as the dominant paradigm to say this is what should be best, or this is those ontological limits. What feeds up to policy, what drives different projects, are sitting with the unequilibrium of Indigenous people within communities. And we've got to acknowledge first that it's not equal. And then once we start acknowledging is how do we get that participation, which then oversees on ontological limits that are being had at the cultural interface. Now, if I was to draw from an analogy, if I was to take you to my country and we go hunting, what you see in the water and what I see in the water is a fish, but you getting that fish is not where it actually is. My knowledge and passed down is to know where to throw that spear, which is the ontological limits that people have at the interface. Is to know that I see the fish, I go to spear it, the fish is not there, the fish sits off, and that's the skewed vision that we are taking in research.
Sorry, if I could just...
It's a fantastic session, so I think there's like 1,000 questions in the room. Folks, my name's Dr. Adi Vius. I'm a public health physician and Deputy Director of the HEAL Network, Australia's first climate health funding from the NHMRC. I have a sort of blasphemous question for the panel, and I think for others in the room as well. Jonathan, I share your deep sense of urgency. Ben, the evidence is there. We just need to package it and send it to people. And our colleague who asked the last question around having a seat at the table, well, dare I say, can we build the table together? But I have a... So bear with me for this, because I've been reading a lot about non-scientific, if you like, or other disciplines. So we're here, it's a global health summit, so we're here to talk about health, and there's science behind health. But I've been looking at the humanities, and there's something which I heard from all panel members. Francis, you talked about ontology and the limits to that. Donald, you talked about Yandra, I've wrote it down, Tandra Vanua, which is about dreaming, you said. Reese, you talked about imagination. Jessica, you talked about storytelling, about sea level rise and things. So my question is this, and it's a challenge because it's a different way of thinking. Are we putting limitations on ourselves by imagination or lack of imagination? So our friends in the humanities disciplines will have grounded imaginaries, social imaginaries, which is more than one way of seeing the world. And get this, I've been reading into this, and there's socio-technical or techno-scientific imaginaries. And let me just read this definition for you, because I wonder if there's a solution here somewhere. So a socio-technical imaginary is where there's collectively held, institutionally stabilised, publicly performed visions of desirable futures. And these are based in technology. So for those of us who work in climate change and health might think, well, sure, we'll decarbonise and it'll be fine. We'll sequester carbon, we'll reduce global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. Maybe it'll happen. But I think what we've heard is there's deep injustices and inequalities which are heading in the other direction, just as the temperature is heading in the wrong direction. So my challenge to the panel is, are we in the wrong business of health, of science? Shall we go do some humanities over here?
Yes. I really like that idea, and I think actually that's been one of my main gripes with the whole way we're trying to attack climate change and other crises. Is the sort of very limited thinking that tends to apply in that space, and the very narrow kind of status quo, business as usual type solutions that we have. Like, just for example, I do a little bit of work in the transport space, and I'm always complaining about how, often our climate solutions in the transport sector are about electrifying the vehicle fleet. So we're basically just doing the same old model, but just a little bit greener, perhaps. And I think it just totally lacks imagination, and I think maybe the sort of thing you're talking about with the public visioning of, what could be, would create the support for a much different kind of future. And so I'd love to know more about these socio-technical imaginaries and other things. That's awesome. Yeah.
And for me, those imaginary for Indigenous people is that relational concept. And to get to a place to imagine a different future, to get to a place only comes about when you know that it starts to affect you. So to feed into the imaginary thought only becomes the issue when you go, well, it's my house that's going to be erased by a cyclone or so forth. And it's almost like I tend to think that unless it's relational or becomes within your sphere of problems, does it become anyone's issue to fix? And we've got to make that concept relational for the people to get on board to go, well, it doesn't have to be my house, but the relational bit is this is a community that's going to get wiped out. And that's their joint imaginary solutions to support what you're saying.
And I think I might quickly just add on to, I think that really sums up the fact that these issues are transdisciplinary. So I think it's important, like climate change, yes, I work in the sciences and I can see scientific point of view, but I also work in policy, so I see that point of view. So I think we really need to remember that when we're tackling health or climate change or whatever it might be, that it is transdisciplinary, and we need to sit around a table and we need to have experts from all different disciplines to tackle the issue. And like we just spoke about, is the fact that it is about relationships. And for Indigenous people, it's not just, the land isn't just a physical thing for us. It's a lot deeper than that. And I think we need to realise that issues such as climate change are a lot deeper than what's just on the level that we see.
Thanks. We've got one question there, and then Professor Langton, I think you can ask a question.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. Ko Michelle Murray tōku ingoa. I just want to say thank you. That was really amazing information that you have shared with us all here today. And I think, Dr. Norna, you said it really well in terms of commitment to action you finished with. So I would challenge everybody here today to have a think about, what are you going to do? What are you going to take from all of this knowledge and embed into what you're doing tomorrow? And it is as simple as, I'm creating a strategy, I'm creating a process, I'm creating a model of care, I'm creating an initiative. Whatever you're doing, how do you now bring in the Indigenous voice into that decision? And is it a table? Does it have to be a table? How do we actually take ourselves out to the community, take the table with us, sit around a fire pit, But I'd really challenge everybody here today to think about what you're going to do tomorrow. Cheers.
Did you want to ask something?
Thanks, Kath. Thanks to all the panellists. I would like to, first of all, remind you, perhaps some of you are too young to remember, that we once in Australia had the National Climate Change Research Facility. National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility, and Francis Pedro Stevens was a member of our Indigenous panel, and we developed the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Indigenous Research Plan 12 years ago, and I'm just now texting you the link to it. So all the research that was conducted under that, funded by that facility, and the research plans have been archived online, so look it up, ncarf.edu, nccarf.edu.au, and it was defunded by Prime Minister Tony Abbott, who remains to this day a climate change denier, and it has never been re-established, and there is no dedicated research fund in Australia. So following up on the point about a future strategy, given that, depending on who you listen to, we as a species on this planet have got something like maybe 15 to 50 years left before our species causes complete planetary collapse. What's the strategy? Have a look at the Indigenous Research Plan. I think it's very good. We had a wonderful committee. We travelled widely in Australia. We took submissions. I think it all still stands. It could be refined. And I want to emphasise, and I'm surprised there was nothing on this panel about it, the minutiae of climate change impacts on health. So, for instance, in Central Australia or the Western Desert or out in the Pilbara, or, anywhere in Australia where the temperature goes above 40 degrees regularly throughout the dry season, and lately it's been going up over 50 in some parts of the Pilbara and regularly over 46, 47 in the East Pilbara, or the West Pilbara, sorry, Aboriginal people who don't have refrigerators or air conditioning cannot keep their medicines safely. So if you suffer from kidney disease or heart disease or diabetes, and the temperature goes above 40 degrees regularly, and you don't have a refrigerator or air conditioning, you know, I can tell you that the medicos down the road have got your death certificate out on the desk already. So, you know, the most vulnerable people in Australia are the poorest Aboriginal people who get the least services, and what's anyone going to do about it? Well, I can tell you that none of the state or territory governments are even considering putting air conditioning into Aboriginal housing. They're certainly not going to assist people to buy a refrigerator to keep their medicines safe. They can't even put a ramp on a house for a wheelchair. So, you know, and with a huge proportion of populations in some communities, like the Tiwi communities, suffering from kidney disease and being disabled by it, in wheelchairs and so on, and on dialysis. You know, climate change has become not just an existential threat, it's a daily, immediate threat to life. So I'd really like to hear some responses to this, because I don't think our remote communities are alone in this problem amongst the low socio-economic populations, the marginalised, and especially Indigenous populations.
Thanks, Professor Langton. Does anyone want to?
Yeah. And again, this is the thing that I see constantly, and the bit that I was trying to speak to, that unless it affects you, does your care go to it? These issues are here now. And, you know, one of the terminologies I use for Torres Straits, being from Zerethkes, Torres Straits, is, you know, the old terminology of when the canary in the mine dies, we evacuate. Well, again, within Australia, Torres Strait could be the first asylum seekers in a first world country. And there needs to be attention put to this. The canary's dead. And we are sitting here going, well, then we really have to start pushing and know that if it's not affecting you, it doesn't mean the problem doesn't exist. So to support what Marcia is saying, it's real. It's within these communities, you know, the power security to actually refrigerate. In Torres Straits, we can go a week on some islands without power. That's in a first world country.
Maybe just to add to that briefly, Marcia, I don't think we get those sorts of temperatures in our country. We sort of dream of 30 degrees in New Zealand, but certainly, yeah, we're seeing the impacts of climate change on Indigenous peoples right now, and I think it's something that can actually help us shift the narrative from what is often, you know, climate change is kind of in a country like ours often seen as a distant threat in terms of, you know, far away and also far off into the future. But, you know, we have to actually paint that picture that it's here and now. And, yeah, just because it may not be affecting you right now doesn't mean it's not hugely important. And the other thing I would say is that there's this narrative that I keep hearing, which is about, oh, it's too late to prevent climate change. All we can do now is adapt to it. And obviously adaptation is really important, but I think we can't kind of split the two. We actually have to do both, and every dollar that we invest has to be, you know, not only helping us adapt to climate change, but also reducing emissions and preventing the worst impacts of climate change.
Yeah, and I think adding to that, that's where this whole concept of climate migration comes from. And I think, you know, it's very easy for me, for instance, to look at climate migration, but I think we really need to understand that, you know, in Australia, like you were saying, it's temperatures above 40 degrees, it's becoming inhabitable. People are actually having to literally move geographical locations because they can't live there anymore. And I think we really need to start going to these communities, asking what they need, What do they need? What do they want? What does this look like? Because we also don't need to just go in and place something on them that they might not need or want. So I think it's really about now going to these communities and bringing them to us and seeing how can we actually improve the lives of these people that they want and need. And obviously here in Australia, it's drought, it's flooding. For Pacific Island nations, it's sea level rise. Whole islands are being just flooded. So I think we really need to realise that, like has been said, it is something that is happening right now. It's in their face every day, and it's something that is impacting not just their health, but their livelihoods and who they are as a people. And that's a lot more detrimental than just the physical.
This discussion is just reminding me how important the political commitment is. And I think for countries in the Pacific outside of Australia, for Fiji, the government changed 1.5 years ago. And before that, when we had to seek national data, we weren't allowed to disaggregate data by ethnicity because we were told it was becoming racist if you disaggregated data. And so it really became a political thing. But as scientists, we know that ethnicity is a biological determinant of health. There is a reason why Africans are predisposed to certain blood disorders. It's because of that ethnicity. So that changed when government changed. But it's just showing me, like today, how important it is that when government puts climate change as a priority, that also the livelihoods and the lives of indigenous peoples and those traditional knowledges are protected by government actually committing to ensuring that that doesn't happen because of that. And so, and the other thing, I think the second thing is the importance of, for countries, again, outside of Australia, we very much get support from Australia, for sustainability, for the purpose of sustainability, it's really important that we look at what other mechanisms that donor countries are requiring to ensure that sustainability happens within country.
Thank you. Well, I think that's all we've got time for today, and a really good point to end off on, that this is a really serious threat for all the planet. It's a threat that's, real for Indigenous communities now, and there's a lot of things that people can learn from listening to Indigenous scholars and Indigenous peoples around reimagining the future. So I'd like you to just give one round of applause, a final round for all the speakers. And for yourself also. So thank you very much for coming and attending and participating in this session. Bye.